ICJ put up there, both sort of the clients they found that were moving money that were suspicious, but also every country has a database where it could be seen how many transactions that were found in the data that we looked at. For instance, this is Indonesia, where the reporters found almost 500 transactions and a lot of money that were moved in and out of banks in Indonesia. I worked on the computer side or the data side of this. So we so what you could see in these reports were basically this. It was some company that made transactions at a certain date or within a certain date interval to another company, and they made those transactions through one or more banks. That sort of is the text that was interesting for us to compile. So this could be an example of a text. This is actually a true example. We've only taken out the banks and the names of the companies. So we could say that at a certain date, a company sent 3 transactions of $700,000 through a certain bank to another company. But this could also be written this way. The company sent 3 transactions and they put the date in the end, for instance, and they put a date interval in there. Or they put the date in the start. So there were a lot of different ways that they could write the same kind of information. And here we have also the interesting form where you sent it through a bank but via another bank. So all of these writings basically describe the same transaction but in a different way. And the important things in this is, of course, what we call the entities. It's sort of the dates, the companies, the number of transactions, the amount, the bank, and the company that received the money. So these are the interesting part. And for instance, one thing that was really interesting was the dates. So how did they write the dates? For instance, if you look at this date, 10/11/12, is that, if I look at it on a Scandinavian way, this would be the 10th of November 2012. But it could also be the 12th of November 2010. Or if you look at it on a US way, it could be the 11th of October 2012. Which date is that? That was really hard for us that was one of the big problems with this. So we have the entities, but what was really important here was also the verbs in the sentences. So did it say sent? Did it say received? Did it say transfer? Or other words like that? And then we had the other words that also mixed things up a little bit. So we started out with something called regular expressions, which is basically a way to look at patterns. And it's a really, I've used that quite a lot when you try to decipher text. And as long as your text is consistent, using regular expression would have worked. The problem was with this that the text wasn't consistent at all, and we found that there were unlimited ways to describe a transactions, which meant that we had to write a regular expression for every single sentence in the material. So instead we turned to machine learning, and I worked together here with 2 great developers that we worked together on this, and we used a model called Named Entity Recognition, NER, which is a way to identify entities. And an entity could be a bank, an amount, a date, a person, a company, of course, and so on. So this model is pre-trained to recognize different kinds of entities. So this is one of the sentences. And when you look at that and you try to read that, you can see that it's very complex. It's a report from a bank. It's 400 transactions. It's transferred by a company in different ways. So the company transferred first 700,000, and then another 2 transactions, and then another 3 transactions. It's really sort of complex, and you can really ask yourselves, where does one sentence start and the next one begin? So as far as we can tell, these are the 3 sentences, but we're not quite sure. We think that that is the 3 sentences. So the question we asked ourselves, is this English? It's English words, but there's no real sentences. And that was one of the problems as well, was that a NER model is pre-trained to understand English. But this is not really English. This is sort of English. This is Englishish English. So we had to retrain the model to understand what we called SARish, which is the English, the way that they write these reports. So basically what we did was that we took some sentences, we ran them through the model, and the model identified the different entities. We checked, we had a small sample that we trained the model on. We checked the samples to see if the model was correct, and if it wasn't, we would feed the model more sentences to train it to better identify the different entities. So you can see here that what we got out of this is sort of a database where we had dates, the company who sent the money, the number of transactions, the amount, the bank, and the company that received the money or was the beneficiary of the money. So what we did was we first had to OCR all the PDFs. Then we had to sort of identify the blocks of text that were the actual reports and split them and run them through the NER model so that we got the entities. And once we had the entities, of course, there were spelling mistakes, there were banks are called different types of things, sometimes the abbreviation of the bank, sometimes the actual long name of the bank, and so on. So we had to do all those kinds of, what should I say, normal data things that we always do. And we had to correct them. And then we put everything into Excel and we shared that with all the reporters that were working on the project. And for us, as it always is when you're working with data and when you're enhancing data or coding data or cleaning data, is that we kept the original sentence in the data so that the reporters could see that this is what we've extracted from the sentence, but they could also read the sentence themselves. And in some cases, of course, because this is not an exact science, the machine learning, the model got it wrong, so therefore it was really important to have the sentence to look at. And we could then have the designated sort of columns, which was the date, where the money originated from, how many transactions, the amount, the bank, and the company that benefited from the transaction, that got the transaction. So we found about 13,000 transactions. We found about 19,000 banks and companies, and we put them all in an Excel document because it was crucial for us that the companies, our media partners, could have easy access to that. And what this really helped them with was that when you did a search, a free text search on a bank, you could get up to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 documents, and that's of course impossible to go through by hand. But what this file helped the reporters with was to narrow down the research. So maybe in the end, they only had to look through 5 or 6 documents instead of those thousands of documents. And this is the Swedish investigative show, SVT's investigative show, Mission Investigate, they're called. And this is the American Leak. You can almost see that it's called the American Leak in Swedish. And we did then both the generals, but also looking at the Swedish banks. There were not a lot of Swedish banks, but there were a couple of Swedish banks that were involved in this. So that was one of the stories where I was very much involved in the data part of the story. I want to step through some other projects of ICIJ as well, just to give you an idea of how to work as a data journalist in those big projects. So I thought I'd start with Panama Papers, and I've called it the start of something beautiful. Panama Papers made such a big splash around the world, and you could think that that was the first big leak we had, but actually we had a lot of leaks before. We had WikiLeaks, of course. We had a couple of leaks from ICIJ, offshore leaks and LuxLeaks, but Panama Papers was so much bigger than anything else and so much more complex. At that time, I was working at The Guardian in London, so I was part of the team there, and I was working at the team as a data journalist. So one of the things that I started out doing very early, and one thing to understand about these leaks, all the leaks that we've gotten actually, is that they're usually the big part of them are text document, which means that you need to find there are no sort of big databases. In some cases we've gotten databases, smaller databases, but it's still been the text documents that has been the bulk of the leak. So what you really want to do is, and I call this the fishing method, which is that you have a fishing rod and you put a name there. For instance, you put Cameron in there for Panama Papers, and you throw out your fishing rod and you hope that you will catch something. And in that case, what came back when you pulled in the fishing rod was Ian Cameron, which was the Prime Minister David Cameron's father, who had a hidden trust where he had hidden away money, which made a big story in the UK at that time. We wanted to see, for instance, how many of the members of the House of Lords, and one of the problems with the website of the House of Lords is that the list only shows the title. So, for instance, for this person, who is the Baroness Adams of Craiglia, I think it's pronounced, her name is Catherine Patricia Irene Adams, but the list only gives us her title. So what I did was that I listed all the all the lords and ladies, and I did a small computer program that extracted out all their real names so that we could run them through the database. And the same way we did with officials from FIFA, we did it from people, the richest people in the world, or the richest people in Britain in this case. And we made all those lists and we ran them through the database, and we found a number of people where we either did separate stories on them, or in this case we sort of collected them all and found, for instance, 6 members of the House of Lords. We found also a couple of members who had previously been in the House of Commons, and so on. Another story that we did had to do with where does the money come from and where does it land. So we had, from Panama Papers, a small database of about 200,000 rows, and in this case that is a small database. And we really wanted to make sure that we country coded everything. So I went through these 200,000 rows by hand actually and coded all the countries. And for instance, here in the middle you can see that the Channel Islands, Jersey, who is a Channel Island, is really interesting because it's a tax haven. So even though they belong to the United Kingdom, for me, it was really important to separate them out. So I had to do that in most cases by hand. And the funny thing was that we had a developer at ICIJ doing this. I spent about 3 weeks doing this, going through by hand all the 200,000 rows. We had a developer at ICIJ who did the same thing programmatically with a script, and he only spent 2 or 3 days on that. But the good thing was that we could then compare our two lists and find that in some cases I had made an error, but actually in some cases his script had made an error as well. So we could then find how many companies there were in each jurisdiction. These were the tax haven companies. How many of the clients, the intermediaries, the ones who were brokering the deals, where they were, and also where the shareholders were, the people who were behind the companies. And we could make this very nice graphic about that, where we could see sort of that they hide their companies in tax haven islands, mostly in Panama. We have the intermediaries, which are, of course, in Switzerland, United Kingdom, in Hong Kong. And then we have the owners who are in Russia, in China, and so on. A third story that we did that was really interesting was that we had that data set about 200 offshore tax haven companies. And in England, it had become public just a year or two ago from sort of when we started the Panama Papers, a public data of all foreign owners of property. So in England and Wales, if you owned a house or for that matter an apartment and you were not a UK citizen, then there was a public record on that. So we were thinking, could we match the offshore companies with this public data? And we had, of course, no company IDs. We only had the names. And the data from the Mossack Fonseca database was really interesting because what they did, and in these cases, there's quite often when you have an offshore company, you will change the name of that to better hide your resources or your assets. So as you can see in the middle here, for instance, you had a company that previously was called Florio Corporation, but it's now changed their name to Mirna Corporation. So I had to go through this by hand and make sort of one row for Mirna and one row for Florio in order to sort of be able to catch both existence of this. And so you can see that I also noted if there were a first, a second, or a third company. And that was one of my lists, and the other list was the overseas company that owned property in England and Wales, which was a public data from the UK government. And it's a little bit cleaner. I had to do some cleaning on that too, but it's a little bit cleaner, a little more sort of. And what I basically did was that I put one table and the other table, and I put them both into a database, and I ran a question that said, could you find me the matches of these two tables? And I used something called a similarity, which is that I said that the names doesn't have to be totally, they can be similar to 90%. And that's a formula that this database uses. And please don't ask me to explain that because I'm not really sure how that works. I started that query over the weekend. I think it ran for like a day or two before it gave me the results. And then, of course, I had to go through all the results by hand to make sure that the companies that were matched together were actual matches. For instance, in some cases, we had different jurisdictions. And then, of course, even if we had the same name, we couldn't be sure that that was the same company because they had different jurisdictions. So this was the reveal on that. We did the secret UK property empires, where we could see that we had businessmen from abroad that were owning huge property in mostly in London. We saw the royal family. It was known that the royal family had some kind of ownership of property in the UK, but this we could reveal how much that was and which buildings it was. Top politicians from around the world, foreign officials from around the world, and so on. And the last example from Panama is actually my favorite because, as I said before, Panama Papers and actually the following sources has, from a data journalist point of view, hasn't been, and they don't like it when I say that in ICJ, but they haven't been the best data projects because the data has been very unstructured. It's just been piles and piles and piles of documents, digital, but piles and piles of documents. So what could we do to make this structured? So could we make our own database, for instance? And what we found was that, for instance, we found these letters that were written to the Financial Investigation Agency in British Virgin Islands from the company Mossack Fonseca. So when a company gets in trouble either with the law or with the tax authority in a country, from quite recent, but there's now an international law that says that the agent, the one who registered the company, and Mossack Fonseca was the agent of this, has to reveal who is the beneficial owner. And the beneficial owner is the person who actually benefits from the company. And that is usually actually separate from the shareholders. The shareholders are usually what we call nominees, which is only sort of people who don't benefit from the company. It could be as somebody from the street or a secretary at the agency or something like that. So, for instance, this is a very typical letter. They say, "Dear Mr. George, we were unable to find the ultimate beneficial owner for this company." Here they say, "Dear Mr. George, the beneficial owner of the company is not known to us." And this is my favorite. It says, "Dear Mr. George, the beneficial owner of the company is Allah Mohammed Hosni Mubarak," which at that time was on every sanctions list that existed in the world, and he was not allowed to have companies, and it should have been the register, the Mossack Fonseca's obligation to actually strike out his companies when he came onto the sanctions list. So I made a search, and I actually searched for "Dear Mr. George" because that was consistent through all these letters. And I basically I typed in all the information that I thought was necessary, which was, for instance, when they sent the letter and when they had to answer, which was very crucial. They only had 24 hours to answer, and that they broke a number of times. And then I had information about the beneficial owner, and we could see that beneficial owners were repeated several times, which is an indication that it's actually not the correct beneficial owner. So we could do the story that the Financial Investigations Agency was not very good at monitoring Mossack Fonseca and in British Virgin Islands. So let me step you through one more example, and then we can stop a little bit for questions. The most recent ICJ project where I worked was the Pandora Papers, and at this time I'm back at Swedish Television, SVT, to work with them. And Pandora Papers was interesting because in the previous, both Panama, where we had that small database of 200 companies, and also in Paradise, we actually, within the leak, there were a database of the clients. But for Pandora, it was just documents. So we had no clue, for instance, and when you're a small country who participates in these, when you participate in these projects, Sweden is not a large country, as you know, and we really wanted to find the Swedes, and the reporters who were working with this, they came to me and said, how can we do this? We really want to have a list of the Swedes in order to sort of find out who they are, and are they interesting to do stories about. So how do we find people? And of course we can do that phishing method that I talked about earlier. You send out a name and you get the documents back. But if you have, in some cases you will get like 10,000 documents back when you have, and especially in Pandora, I think that there were a lot of, for instance, newspaper clippings included in the leak for some strange reason. And that made it sort of a lot of false positives when we did the search. So how do we define people? Well, one of the things that people do when they want to register a company in a tax haven is that they send a copy of their passport. So, and we found this through the leaks, not just Pandora, but also Paradise and Panama, that we found these copies of passports. So could we use those copies? Well, this is a passport. This is actually my passport. And as you probably know, most passports, they differ a little bit, but most passports has this 2 lines in the bottom of the page that contains all the identification of the persons. So if we look at those lines, we can see that, for instance, we have the nationality here, SVE for me. We have the first and last names separated with those brackets. We have my passport number. We have my gender. We have the date of birth, actually twice. What I've circled here is actually the Swedish national number, which of course in other countries will not be present, but you also have the date of birth. So what I could do is that we could see these patterns, and this is now back to, remember how I was talking about regular expressions in the beginning, to see patterns. This is a time where actually regular expressions works brilliantly because the pattern are there. It's always starts, almost always I should say, not all passports, but most passports starts with a P. And then you have the nationality, 3 letters of the nationality. You have the last name, and then you have 2 brackets, and then you have the first names with 1 bracket in between all the names. And then on the second row, you have similar patterns that you can parse out the details on that. And so we got a batch of where we could identify sort of the picture of the passport. So we got those documents. And we could then use a small Python program basically to extract out, and you can see the regular expressions here, to find the different kinds of patterns. And for doing that, we could then identify the Swedes, but also the other nationalities. So we shared this both. Actually, it started out as a project for the Swedish reporters, but I got so many passports that wasn't Swedish that I actually turned it into an international project and shared the list of passports with all the I got all the nationalities down into an Excel spreadsheet that I shared with the project. So this was my presentation. I should, let's see if I can stop the sharing. There we go. Thank you very much. And let's see, this is going to be very interesting if you can hear me, if I can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much, Helena. So can you hear me now?
And I can't, I'm sorry. Let me see if I can change something.
Looks like,
Yeah,
yes,
I
now?
hear you. Yes, I hear you.
Okay, that's
Good.
great. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was a very interesting presentation from Helena. And for me, myself, actually, to be very honest, I like to question everything because, for instance, from the very basic stuff, like how do you like the skills that you that we a journalist should have to be able to crack the codes to investigate the papers, things like that. So yeah, I actually have some questions myself, but let's check from the audience. Uh, are there any questions from our participants today? Okay, we're still waiting, I guess, on the Q&A box. And oh yeah, we have some. Okay, so yeah, there's the first question from Sirtu Pilali. All of this data is very complex. How can you relate all this data to dismantling tax crimes in Panama Papers? So yeah, probably that's the first one, Elena.
That's the first one, and that's a tricky one, and that is why it takes so long to do these projects. Is that what we get with these leaks are very seldom the whole picture. We get bits and pieces of where we can sort of suspect that something is going on that is not. I mean, there is. I should point out that. Um, I should point out that not every tax haven company has. There's not anything illegal about having a tax company in a tax haven, and there's some cases where it's perfectly justified to have a company in a tax haven. So that's very sort of. So we can't assume that just because we find somebody and they have a tax haven company that they have hidden every asset and not paid tax in their actual country there. So we have to find that out somehow. So it is a matter of piecing a puzzle together. So we will get some documents within the leak, and then we'll have to sort of do normal reporting in the country where we're. So in Sweden, we will look at different kinds of records, company records, maybe tax records. We'll talk to people that has maybe worked on those companies and so on. So we will do normal reporting. So what the leaks helps us with is actually just pieces of the puzzle. So it's very complex, and I know that the reporters that I work with describes this as going down a rabbit hole. So you find this great, you see, oh great, this is a well-known Swedish company and a well-known businessman in Sweden, and we take him and we follow all the pieces down and we do all the additional reporting, and we find out that we can't prove anything. So then we'll have to put him aside, and then we find the next one and we do that. So it's a real time consuming work that the reporters are doing. But that is sort of what the leaks gives us is at least a little bit of insight into this world where so much money is stored away that should be taxed, and the taxes should then be used for schools and roads and healthcare and all that thing in our countries.
And yeah, probably just to follow up about Panama Papers, I think you mentioned that during the investigation, you found out that there's only a name from the documents, the leaked documents, and then and you have to confirm it whether it's really a member of parliament or something. So
Yeah.
during the process, did you connect with authorities to check their database as well? And how did you convince them to help you to confirm these data and files?
It depends on what country you work in. I would say Sweden has a very sort of a history of very open, transparent, of a lot of transparency, and we get a lot of public documents there. So then sort of checking, for instance, an address. If you don't, sometimes you just find a name, that's true, but sometimes you will find an address, or you will find other information that will identify the company or the person. So in Sweden, you could very easily sort of check addresses. We used a lot of public data to sort of check in different countries in to try to confirm, and in most cases we also actually before publication send letters to the persons or the heads of companies that we have looked at. So in England that is, and in the US that is obligatory to do that. So we sort of send them letters saying, we have found this and this and this and this and this, and please tell us if everything is wrong. And so on. So we will try to confirm it in two ways. We try to sort of talk to people, we try to look in public data, but we also actually confront the people and then they have the chance to sort of say, no, this is not true. And then, of course, in some cases, they say it's not true, but we're still convinced that it's true, so then we'll publish anyway.
Okay, yeah, probably this is just a small bit because it's
and now
related
you're gone
to...
again. What is this?
Oh, okay. Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, so probably a bit before we there's a related question from Ismail Zakaria. So have you ever received any intimidation or probably rejection from the authorities to confirm the data that you had?
There's a lot. I mean, intimidation, no, but a lot of rejection, of course, that they won't give us the data or they won't tell us things. That is, I think, what we work with journalists all over the world. Of course, it's in some countries it's much harder, and in some countries it's a little bit easier. But I think that authorities trying to escape, we have that. So we work with it the way that every journalist work with it. We try a different source, or we try a different way to confirm things. And in some cases, you will have a really good story that you just can't confirm. So you just have to, put that aside and not publish that. It's what happens, sort of. But that is not, I think that is not for the leaks. It's for every journalism, sort of. That's whatever you do in journalism. You always have to sort of have confirmation on what you do when you do. And that's at least investigative journalism is in general. So yes, it has been, but I can't tell you a specific case. And luckily, I will say that I live in a country where authorities it has happened, of course, but it's not usual that we get intimidated by authorities. But I am full of and admiration for people who live in countries where that is standard and general, daily, sort of. We have it very easy compared to you.
Okay, I see. Okay, we will move on to our next question. It's from Gea from Radio Republik Indonesia, our state-owned radio channel. There are two questions. The first one, what is the urgency of FinCen files for bank in the world, especially in Indonesia? We have Bank of Indonesia, the central bank.
Yeah.
That's the first one. And the second one, what about the safety of the journalists? This is actually probably you need to, share more about the investigation, about the experience about the safety, and then the struggle to get confirmation from authorities. Yeah, go ahead, Helena.
Yeah, okay. So the FinCen files FinCen is an American agency or authority. So the focus on that was, of course, the American banks who were reporting in, but banks all over the world were also reporting into FinCen. But I think that without knowing specifically about Bank of Indonesia, I would say that probably it's the same as it was for the Swedish banks, which was that we found a number of reports, but it was very obvious that there has been a lot of other transactions, because we've also had other leaks that hasn't been reported to FinCen. I'm sorry. But instead it's been reported maybe to the Swedish financial police. So I would say the situation is probably the same in Indonesia. There is some information at the ICIJ website where you could sort of go and look to see what kind of transactions was found when it came to Bank of Indonesia. When it comes to the safety and security, I think that it's a discussion for every project, not just for FinCen, but for Panama and Pandora. But we also find that because we're doing this all over the world, because we are a lot of journalists from different countries that are doing this. I beg your pardon. I should have brought a glass of water. Because we're doing this, we will protect each other in a way. There's a protection in the masses. So that's really the case of that.
So actually, if you want to take a break, it's very okay, Helena.
I'm so sorry. Could you please repeat that? I'm so sorry.
No problem. I mean, you can
Yeah.
take a break if you want.
Yeah, no
I
problem.
mean, yeah,
I think I'm fine.
get a glass of water or anything. Anyway, yeah. So just to confirm again, so actually all the data of the FinCen files, including the Indonesian transactions, maybe it's stored in the ICIJ website.
Well, an aggregation, I should say, not all the data, not the documents and not, but the sort of the number of transactions and the money and so on is stored there, and a little bit information of where it has gone from Indonesia or come into Indonesia, sort of. So there's a part of it but not the whole data is not there.
Okay, but if we request to ICIJ, Indonesian journalists request to ICIJ, is it possible
You
to
could
get
talk
the
to
data?
ICJ and see if they are willing to share a little bit more. I don't actually remember if there were an Indonesian partner at the FinCen files.
Okay. Okay, well that's
Yeah.
also, I think, a
Yeah.
good opportunity to follow up, I guess,
Yeah.
for us. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do we have another question? Probably let's go back to the safety of journalists
Yeah.
and about the struggle to confirm the data and how to get around the authorities. Uh, well, you've mentioned that it needs, we journalists, I think we need to back each other and things like that. But what actually, I would love, probably other participants would also love to hear more whether your experience with the Guardian or the ICAJ, where probably there was a struggle, and how did you, there was a problem with authorities or probably intimidations from the related parties, and how did you overcome the problems?
Well,
challenge?
one story is, of course, Panama Papers there was a lot of Russian, there were a lot of Russian contents in Panama Papers, and the Guardian, together with the rest of the partners, could, for instance, reveal that there was a close friend of Vladimir Putin where we found a lot of documents about him in Panama Papers, and we could find that he had hidden away a lot of money, much more money. That he is a cellist, I think, so we could see that there was lots more money than what a cellist would, normally have. And of course, we had people working on that also in Russia, but they could, for obvious reasons, not do a lot of, they could do some reporting for us, but they couldn't really put their names on the articles and so on. So there were a typical sort of collaboration where we had people in the UK who would work together with the Russian reporters and sort of help to get the story out, with the sort of safety of it being a Guardian story and not published by a Russian journalist. That is one way to sort of try at least to secure the safety of journalists who live in countries where authorities are threatening them. So that would be one example. And I think that we've had several, I can't really think of none now, but we've had several where just we would in some cases move stories from different sort of, so because we work all together, we have all the ICIJ projects work like this, that we have a secret forum, almost like Facebook, or or a wiki where everybody shares everything. And I think that was really, really enhanced when we came to Panama Papers, where we were 350 journalists who all shared all the information. And even journalists who are competitors, like the BBC and the Guardian, who are fierce competitors, for instance, in the UK, they will, but because we were working on the same project, we would work together, we would share information, and by sharing information, we also can get around in some cases where one authority in one country might not give you that information, but maybe that information has been discovered in another country, and because we share the whole thing. And it is really important, and it's in one way against journalistic nature. I mean, as journalists, we are told that if we have an exclusive story, we should only work on it ourselves, and maybe even not tell our editor, and we will certainly not tell everybody else, sort of. So it was working with ICIJ is a break of culture when it comes to journalists, but we can see that the benefits are so large when we all come together and do the same story. And it also is good for people who are in countries where journalists get intimidated or threatened, where we can see that if those authorities sees that you're not alone. And I mean, we had a horrible experience when it came to Panama Papers, where there were a Maltese journalists who were killed because of the revelations in Panama Papers. And that has been work of many journalists that came together to try to reveal her stories, but also reveal her killer. And I think that there was a trial here a couple of years ago for that. So I mean, there is a safety in numbers, but of course the safety is not complete because there has been a lot of trouble.
So having this strong collaboration and network of international across countries, journalists across countries is also very, very critical to ensure safety for all journalists. Okay, we are still waiting for more questions from our participants. So go ahead, ladies and gentlemen. If you have questions, don't hesitate to write down your questions on the Q&A box, and I will ask Helena about it. But meanwhile, probably I would go back to my pretty basic questions. But I hope this is I think this is important to know for all of us Indonesian journalists. So as a data journalist, how did you manage to develop your skills? For instance, like coding. I saw a little bit of coding there, and then probably when you have the passport information, you manage to know just how to crack the code on the what's in the passport page coding. So how did you develop your skills in what is it, in interpreting or cracking the data? Can you please tell us?
I think that the interesting part of the data journalism community in the world is that we are, and especially I started out very early in data journalism. This was in 97 or 96, 1997, 1998, something like that, where then I was the only one in my company who did any kind of this, who worked with any kind of spreadsheet, for instance. We worked with Excel at that time. And actually there were a lot of people like me. There were not a lot of people like me. There were just a few people like me, but they were also alone in their newsrooms. So there would be one guy at the New York Times. There would be one guy at and so because we were we didn't have a lot of colleagues that understood what we were doing, we would turn to each other. So I have learned most of my skills, I have learned by talking to other people who work maybe in competitors, but we have this saying where we want to share methods, we want to teach each other about methods. We can compete about the stories, but the methods, I will never say that I won't teach you how to program, because then you will do a better story. I hope you will do a better story if I teach you how to code, So that is sort of the general thing. I think also that as a data journalist, you start to think, because I'm new at my new company and they are new to data journalism, I talk a lot about structure. I think that for a data journalist, structure is sort of the core of everything. So for instance, in some cases that I showed you now, it's just about structuring things. I structure the letters so that we can see the patterns on the fact that they didn't reveal the beneficial owners, for instance. And once you've started, and actually that's how I started out with structures. And then you hear about people who connect to files. Okay, so then you talk about that. And when it comes to coding, I'm actually a lousy coder. And anybody who is listening who looked at the code will see that I do very small snippets of code. And that is, I think, for most data journalists, that is a matter of stealing. So I will go on internet and I will Google, regular expressions, and then I will see, okay, so and then I will steal a little bit of code for somebody who has published that on the net. Or I will go on or I will ask somebody, I saw that you did this, could you share your code with me? And in most cases, people actually want to share your codes with you. Or we will be, now when there's a little bit more of us. When I was starting out and all up until, I would say 2008, 2009, we have one big conference that we meet. We were about 200-300 people on that conference. And the recent years, we've been 1,000 people on that conference. So there's more of us now. And I have Swedish colleagues that I can discuss with and say, if you were to do that, how would you do that? How would you think? So it's all a matter. Actually, I think that if you ask all the data journalists around the world, they will say they've learned their skills by either trying themselves with a lot of Googling or talking to colleagues about how to do this. And because we're still a small community in the world, we know each other, and I know that I can reach out to somebody and say, I saw that you did that great story. I would love to use that method for a story that I'm doing. Could you explain to me how you did that? And most of the times, almost all of the time, they will be happy to explain.
But did you have like formal training during the process?
I did. I have two sets of formal training. I did a little bit when when I left high school. I did a 1-year class in programming, but this is in the 1980s, so it's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I worked very briefly as a computer programmer in the late 80s and early 90s before I went to journalism school. And I think that the skills that I bring with me from that is not so much how to program, because programming is completely different now than it was then, but maybe that I'm not afraid of a computer, and that I do know how to do a loop, or how to do, how the basics of a computer program works. Then the only sort of formal training I've had when it comes to data journalism is a 1 week. My bosses in 97 sent me to a 1 week class in the US of data journalism class, which also was sort of the basic how to use a spreadsheet, how to use a database. There were no programming there. There was just sort of how to use a spreadsheet, how to use a database. But the most important thing, I think, and what I try when I teach, is it's not so much about knowing which button to press on your computer. It's how you think. It's thinking about structure. It's thinking about context. How can I put this into context? And that is sort of the whole. If you have that thinking, you can then it's just sort of a matter of googling what buttons to press. It's much easier. I actually find that if I have an experienced journalist who hasn't done data before, but has done a lot of different journalism, it's actually very easy to teach that person to go, take that extra step, because the journalism part of data journalism is the most important part. We are all doing journalism for the stories, and using sort of these methods, knowing how to press the buttons, knowing how to code or do Excel or databases, is just a method to do the story. But if you are a journalist, and you can start looking, I look at tables the same way that maybe you people, when you talk to people, I look at a database and I interview it the way that you will interview a person, and see, is there a story there? Okay, no, there's not a story there. So maybe I'll ask this question. Oh, that's an interesting answer, but I need a follow-up question. So I sort of talk to the database the same way that you would talk to an expert or a source of some kind, to sort of find the story. So for me, it's easier to teach an established journalist a little bit of data. But when I teach students, actually they are very quick to learn how to press the buttons, but they don't see the stories. They just see the buttons and the numbers. They don't see that could be an interesting story. Or, I'm so sorry that it's making sounds. They don't see the actual story. So that's really interesting. And if I may, I see that I have a couple of minutes. I had an example. I was teaching students, and we did this really simple Excel spreadsheet of how many people who had died from COVID in Sweden every day, sort of. So I wanted them to take that data, to calculate a weekly median, and then just make a graph over this, so that we could see, the different waves. I mean, it's looked the same all over the world. We've had 1 wave, 2 waves, 3 waves. In order to get them to understand that a graphic could just not be a graphic, but it could also give you new information. So I had several students who made the calculations wrong. So instead they got this huge curve that just were, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it sort of ended on there being 2 million deaths one day in Sweden, and Sweden has only 10 million people. And I said to them, when I looked at it, I said, is this reasonable? Have we seen this on the news, that there were 2 million people who died from COVID one day or 1 week? And that is the problem with sort of students, because they didn't sort of think about the story. An established journalist should immediately say, I've done something wrong, I have to redo this, because it's not. So I think that learning data is just another tool that you put in your toolbox. The most important thing with data journalism is your journalistic nose and your sort of journalistic knowledge, because it's stories we want to tell. And I think that's also what I've tried to sort of find in this sort of presentation, is that what we're really looking for, yes, there are different methods that I use, but the stories are important.
Yeah, thank you, Helena. I'm asking again from the audience. I'm inviting again if there are more questions for Helena. Yeah. Probably. Meanwhile, you were saying that it's actually the journalism skills that matters, and because in the end, this is just numbers and probably a bunch of coding if we don't if we can't really interpret them. So what are your suggestions to strengthen journalism skills for data journalists? Probably this is last question. There's,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
usually I get asked the other question, which is sort of what is the data skills to strengthen a journalist in data? Yeah, but
yeah,
so that's an interesting question. I think that if you are, because there are people who say to me, we could just hire a developer or a programmer to do your work. And I say, no, you can't. Because the, and I think that I think it's a great question that you're asking, because what I've found, since I've also worked with developers who come into a project with just the technical skills, they don't have journalism skills, they have great technical skills. But what I find over time is that the best way to teach them about journalism is to do journalism with them, not to say to them, I need you to extract this text from this passport, go, and they go to a separate room and they sit their work. But instead to sit next to them, to have them involved in everything, to sort of say, oh, it's really interesting that we found so many passports from China. That could be the indication of blah. I mean, showing them why it's not just the technique that's important, it's also interpreting what we find when we use the technique. So for me, it's been, whenever I worked with developers, I've always insisted that we sit in the same table, that we talk about the stories, that we talk about, because otherwise it becomes, usually it doesn't go very well. The few times where my company has told me, for instance, no, you will have to do, you have to make a list of the things that they should do and give them the list, and then they work on the side and you work here and they work there. It's always gone wrong, I would say. Because also you all know, because you're all, journalists or journalism students, that a journalistic story has, sometimes it moves very quickly. You will have an angle or a point of view one day, and then you do some investigations, and then you do some more, and you talk to people, and on the second day your angle is over here instead, because you found that the story is here and not there. And for developers who are used to sort of having a list of things to do, and that list doesn't change, for us that list can change within an hour. We don't want you to find this anymore, we want you to find that. So it's really important. I would say that they learn the way that I learned journalism, by doing it, sort of. That's, you sort of, and I found that is the most important thing. And to chat about what have we found? Why is this interesting? And that is the most interesting. And they can also come with, they can ask you these questions. Why is that interesting? And you say, wait a minute, I have to think about why I think this is interesting. And it helps me actually be a better journalist as well.
I see. Okay, probably there's one last question very quickly, Helena. So for our here Indonesian journalists, how can we expand our network so we can be in touch with important people leaking the secretive documents? Any tips for that?
I think that what I have done, because I'm also from a small country, uh, is that I have tried to participate in different conferences, for instance. And now most conferences will be both online and, there's been a lot of changes in that over the years. You don't have to travel to the US, you can participate online. But also reach out to people. If you find a lecture on YouTube, or if you listen to a lecture on a conference and you think, I need to ask this person this, reach out to them. I would say that 9 times out of 10, they will respond to you. So it's a way of building a network that way. I know that every training I do, whether it's in Sweden or it's in an international location, I always end my speech, and I will do that now too, with saying that once you've listened to me, you have access for me for life. So if you have a question about data or a question on how to do data, please reach out to me. I have my name as my Gmail, so it's helena.bengtsson@gmail, and I will usually answer questions if people ask questions about how to do things with data or how to think when they approach a data project, for instance. So I will say that that's how I've done it, because I'm also from a small country and it's very expensive to travel to conference. I've tried to convince my company to let me travel to conferences, and sometimes I've worked and sometimes I participate online. And so I think that learn that we are a very open community that welcomes everybody who's interested, and so that is what I would do. And also read about data journalism. Try to, when there is a story, try to read the methods. There's usually what we do is that we write a fact box or a separate story that says how we did things. Well, read them and try to understand it and try to see, can I do a story in my country or in my region in the similar way? Sort of steal stories. That's a good way of learning also.
Steal stories.
Yeah.
That's awesome to close the session.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Helena. Unfortunately, we run out of time right now. That was a very insightful conversation from you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think see you in the next session. And